Okay, here it is again. Now here we are. We're at lecture 50. Holy cow. 50 of these that we've gone through. Hours worth of time that we've spent on dealing with American history. We're almost done. I don't know if we're going to quite make it to lecture 60. We'll see. But we're getting there. So anyway, what we're going to talk about today, or learn about today, is a couple of things that were happening with regard to American liberalism in the 1960s and leading into the 1970s. We're going to kind of change some of the shape and some of the assumptions that were going on with regard to American liberalism at this time. And that is the rise of what we could call the New Left, and a series of programs referred to as the Great Society. We're going to talk about maybe how these things interact during this particular period. So moving right along, we're going to analyze the influences of the political movements of the 1950s and 60s on the development of New Left ideology. And that's a lot of it. So we really want to take a look at the evolution. I mean, we've spent a lot of time during this year talking about liberalism and conservatism with regard to politics, mostly from my own particular bias. It's something that I'm interested in politics, and I'm interested in these shifts and dynamics in liberal thought and in conservative thought. And if you remember kind of the framework that we talked about in understanding liberalism and conservatism, I did not want to look at these political philosophies using that little the little box with social laws and economics, and then kind of look at conservatism and liberalism as a defense of certain policies and positions. I wanted to look at it more in a broader scope, in a broader frame. So we went back and we defined these terms as what do we mean by liberalism and conservatism, whereas liberalism is a philosophy, a political philosophy that emphasizes social change for the sake of improving society, of increasing justice and equality. Those tend to be the focus of liberalism, whereas and the emphasis of liberalism is on that social change, whereas conservatism tends to favor and tends to lean towards social stability, usually by supporting and maintaining existing institutions and hierarchies. So the reason why I'm focusing on that, and the reason why I've chosen that as my frame of reference with regard to these ideologies, is because the box method doesn't really take into account changes in culture and changes in ideology over time. And since we've gone through the political scale of American history, from the founding of the United States as a nation all the way through to today, ultimately, we can't really take a look at liberalism and conservatism as it existed in 1776 and say it's exactly the same as it is in 2015. It just doesn't work that way. Well, then what happened, Mr. Adosha? How can these things change, and why did they change? So I want to kind of give a brief little overview of maybe our evolution of liberalism. And we'll be talking about conservatism later on. We talk about the rise of the New Left. There will also be a rise of a new right that's happening pretty much at the same time. And there has to be. Both of these political ideas and these philosophies have to change and shift over time. And then that makes the study of history so much more confusing. So what do we have? When we started off talking about liberalism in the late 18th centuries, right? So we're talking about Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence. We talked a little bit about, I think we talked a little bit about Adam Smith and his ideas of capitalism and free markets. These are probably two of the seminal ideas behind what we would refer to as classical liberalism, right? And classical liberalism is going to be influenced by the challenges of existing in a monarchical society, in a society that is run by kings and by royally appointed governors and things along those lines, and that kind of a hierarchy where title and status was based on ascribed status. In other words, you were born into it. And yet, during this period of time in the 18th century, we're starting to see the rise of a merchant class that has become extremely, extremely important and extremely successful in society. And therefore, these are folks who want to have a certain amount of political clout. And they are going to embrace these ideas of personal liberty and personal freedom in order to perpetuate their own agenda. Of course, obviously, if you are very successful in making lots and lots of money, but you are not a member of the royal family or the royal of nobility, and you can't get access to that status, of course you want to change that particular system. So that was what we would refer to as classical liberalism. It's influenced by the challenges of a monarchical society that were repressing a certain group of people, mostly the merchant class, or as Marx would refer to them as the bourgeoisie, or what have you. And these folks are going to come together and say, wait a minute, we have certain rights to property, we have certain rights to free speech and liberty. So that's kind of the idea behind classical liberalism. And classical liberalism really emphasizes the idea that, hey, look, governments are very, very destructive. Governments are oppressive. Of course, that is their frame of reference. Governments have been very oppressive over time. And consequently, the less influence that governments have over individual liberty and individuals and markets, the better off we are. So the classical liberals are those people who are going to kind of emphasize those small government ideas. And it worked beautifully. Over time, right? I mean, these ideas we did limit the effects of government. We liberated our markets. We emphasized rights, and we emphasized, freedom of speech and things along those lines. And what ended up happening? Well, we ended up creating, during this particular period of time, we ended up creating a capitalist society. We ended up creating a republican form of government in which people elect representatives to represent them in government, and pretty much this spread throughout the world, throughout especially the Western world. And we created an industrial society, and this industrial society required large amounts of capital in order to make it work. And it worked very, very well. These societies did extend freedom. They did extend personal liberties to people. People were much better off under these classical liberal societies than they'd ever been under monarchical societies. And tremendous amount of wealth, technology improvements, all of the things that came along with this industrial revolution. So we can kind of see this in the early years of American society, American liberalism, emphasizing this idea and building this great capitalist and industrialist republican form of government. However, we also noticed, when we moved into the Gilded Age, we saw that, we were probably better off than we were under the monarchs and under a royal system, the old conservative traditionalist system. But where not everybody's, making out better. There are tremendous abuses that are taking place, and it turns out that government isn't the only oppressive institution in society. That in fact, businesses and corporations and companies and monopolies can be just as oppressive and just as stultifying as the old kingdoms could be. So what is going to end up happening is we're going to start to see the development. Liberalism is going to kind of shift and say, well, wait a minute. We don't like the idea of an oppressive government, but we also don't like the idea of an oppressive marketplace. We have people who are working in factories that, making almost nothing, living on subsistence. And we start to say, well, wait a minute, maybe limited government is good, but maybe there should be some things that government does in the public trust to kind of level the playing field for the little guy, because these monopolies and these robber barons are taking advantage, and they're wielding way too much power. And we start to see the development of what we kind of would call progressive liberalism, right? So we see the progressive age, and this is where we start to turn to the government to take care of certain things, to be active in creating a liberal society, a society in which, yes, we have personal liberty and personal freedoms, but we also have a relatively level playing field. My personal liberties and freedoms are nothing if your power is so much higher than mine, and your economic wealth is so much higher than mine that you can kind of hold me down. So this is the idea behind progressive liberalism. So it's influenced by industrial capitalism and laissez-faire government, and the abuses that are taking place under those systems. And its core beliefs are in an activist government that is going to level the playing field for the little guy and is going to maintain certain things in the public trust. And as we recall, we move from this idea of progressive liberalism kind of very easily transitions into the new, what we would refer to as the New Deal liberalism. Now, the New Deal version of liberalism is going to be influenced by, of course, the American experiences under the Great Depression, and, of course, the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in trying to lift us out of the Great Depression, or at least get us through the Great Depression. And this is where the government did, in fact, take huge steps in creating a social safety net. So the beliefs of the New Deal liberals is that social safety nets have to be created for those people who are the less fortunate in our society, and that the government is going to have to directly regulate those companies and those institutions that are in a position to accumulate tremendous amounts of wealth and create large amounts of wealth inequality. So the idea behind New Deal liberalism is we're going to basically have to redistribute the wealth to a certain extent. We're going to have to provide for the poor, and we're going to have to kind of keep tamp down on the very, very wealthy. So these are the ideas of this New Deal liberalism. Now, what does that leave us with regard to liberalism after World War II? I mean, it sure looked like after World War II that the New Deal had pretty much won out. There was, with these New Deal programs, yes, after we finally get out of World War II and out of these extreme circumstances, right, now we enter into the 1950s and we can kind of see a normalization of life after, of course, the depredations of the New Deal and World War II. We can kind of get ourselves returning back to normal, and there was kind of a conservative turn at this point, because people are tired and they do want to have a social stability, and they do want to kind of get things back to normal. But the New Deal programs were very well entrenched and very and still very popular for the most part. So it sure looked like the New Deal won out. These New Deal programs were in place. Wealth distribution was not necessarily equal, but it was certainly a lot. The wealth gap was a lot smaller than it had ever been. Labor had become very, very powerful. Labor unions had become powerful and had a say in government and had a say in the workplace, which meant that wages were relatively high. People were getting benefits. There were government loans to try to help people get mortgages and things along those lines. So we had expanded the middle class. We had ushered in probably a period, probably one of the greatest periods of wealth expansion in American history, especially with regard to growing that middle class. We had become a middle class society under these New Deal programs. So New Deal wins, right? It works out pretty good. I mean, even when you look at a relatively conservative, a moderate conservative like Dwight Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower didn't like the idea of large government, but at the same time, he also wasn't about to touch these New Deal programs. In fact, he adds to them, right? He creates the federal highway system, the interstate highway system, right? Which was one of the biggest public works projects in history. Also, the space race. He ushered in the space race. That's kind of New Deal-ish when we stop and think about it. These weren't private investors for the most part. This was government, bringing us out into space. So even relative moderate conservatives have kind of embraced this New Deal dogma. But wait a minute, if it's working out and this becomes the established norm, then what's left for the liberals to do? What is there to change, right? Well, fortunately for liberals, the New Deal did not usher in a utopia. Yes, there were things that were much improved under this new system of government, but there were also things that were problematic. And we've talked about some of these things in the last few lectures with regard to society and culture in the 1950s and the 1960s. So what is coming in is is this idea that we'll refer to as the new left. These new influences on liberalism, and how are we going to look at liberalism now? Now, liberalism at this stage of the game is going to be influenced by a couple of things. This new left is going to be influenced by a couple of things. First, the fact that yes, the New Deal liberalism seems to be working pretty well, but there's still a tremendous people who are left out in the cold with regard to this. So with the passage or the publication of a book called The Other America, we actually get to see that, well, wait a minute, about 20% of Americans really aren't benefiting much from this from this New Deal liberalism at this stage of the game. We still have relatively high levels of poverty. Still better off than being poor anywhere else. But still, how do we justify that we have so much wealth accumulating in the United States and yet such relatively high levels of poverty? It's hard to justify. Also, the New Left is going to respond to and be influenced by the fact that, hey, let's face it, at the push of a button, we can vaporize life on Earth. Well, that's kind of an eye-opener, and we might want to do something about that. Maybe we have gotten to the point where warfare is simply just not worth it. So these are a couple of the influences, and what about the beliefs? What are the beliefs of this New Deal? I'm sorry, of this New Left. Well, you got to understand where the New Left is born. The New Left is really going to be born. It's going to be very much influenced by. By the way, another influence here that we can put under is the Civil Rights Movement and the successes of the Civil Rights Movement, and the dedication of those people who were involved in the Civil Rights Movement is really going to leave its mark on these folks who are developing these ideas of the New Left. The New Left is going to be born. Well, it's going to be born by largely middle-class white college kids. I mean, you don't get too much more elitist than this to a certain extent, and this is a criticism of the New Left, is that it does tend to have these kind of elitist, attributes. Whereas the New Deal is something that has been supported and embraced by labor and by working people, almost that populist kind of feel to it. The New Left is largely not. The New Left is going to be born among young idealistic college students who are reading Marx and reading, other, Sartre and some of these other writers as well, getting involved in these things. So, we can kind of take a look at probably one of the best birthplaces of this. It's going to be Michigan, Port Huron. We're a group of young people under the kind of the leadership of Tom Hayden here, pictured here, are going to get together, and they're pretty much going to write the rules almost for the New Left. They will form a group called the Students for Democratic Society, and these are young people who are looking around and they're looking at the society that they see, and they're realizing, you know what, liberalism isn't necessarily going to come from the unions anymore. I mean, let's face it. Many of these unions are corrupt. Many of them have been corrupted by politics, but many of them have been corrupted by outside forces. So this labor activism isn't necessarily going to lead us there. What's going to lead us there? Well, maybe an intellectual, youthful intellectual group of liberals is going to focus on this, and consequently, one of the things that the Students for Democratic Society is really going to stand for is this idea of participatory democracy, and they're going to pull this directly from the Civil Rights Movement and the activism of the Civil Rights Movement, that people should have a say in what's going on around them, and they should actively pursue that. And among the reforms that they're going to want to look for is actually having students having an input into their universities. They're getting a first-hand account of some of these universities that have become very, very large and very, very dogmatic and very, very bureaucratic, and just they don't represent the needs of this new generation. The SDS is also going to look at ideas of personal freedom. This is kind of a rejection of that progressive idea of moral perfection. These are folks who are going to look out and say, hey, wait a minute, I can perfect myself, thank you very much, if you just leave me alone. So they don't want, they want to have, popular participation in the political process, but also they need to have the personal freedom to do just that. I have to be able to develop my own, unique outlook on life. And this is a rejection of that conformist streak that was happening in the 1950s, right? That institutional man kind of, or the corporate man kind of idea, company man kind of idea, in which I'm going to fit myself into the cog of the machine. No, I want to be able to pursue my own way. And if my way isn't your way, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a worse way, or that my way is better. And finally, the New Left is going to be weary and critical of pretty much any form of authority that is going to almost mindlessly contain and control the citizens, of the average individual. They refer to this as the establishment, right? Establishment thinking, and just blindly accepting and embracing authority simply because they are people who are in positions of authority. No, they are the establishment. And according to this idea of the New Left, once you become a member of the establishment and you benefit from the establishment, then your goal is to preserve the establishment, right? Even at the expense of other people who are not benefiting from this establishment. So they were anti-establishment. So these ideas: participatory democracy, personal freedom, and a critique of established hierarchies, or the quote-unquote the establishment, or as could be said, the man. Now you can kind of see that these guys also have an awful lot to do with the counterculture that was going on during this time. Of course, the counterculture embraced a lot of these ideas: personal expression, pursuing your own ends. And these folks here are actually going to write down what they're saying in something called the Port Huron Statement, which I think we talked about earlier. The Students for Democratic Society are going to be instrumental in the Berkeley free speech revolt that took place. Of course, we can't rule out there were also conservative groups that were involved in this as well, and we can't rule those out. But this was part of this new left, this active politics, and this active political intrigue. It is referred to in the book Liberty, Equality, and Power, which is a AP level textbook. It says the New Left sought to reorient politics. Cultural activists urged people to expand their minds, often with a little help from drugs and rock music, and to seek alternative ways of living their lives. Iconic images from the 1960s provided a kaleidoscopic panorama of what can be called a movement of movements. So wow, we've heard this before. Now, we've talked about this movement of movements before. We talked about the progressives. The progressives, kind of started this same way. A whole bunch of movements kind of moving in the same direction. And we can almost say the same thing about classical liberalism. And maybe this is an inherent part of liberalism. The New Deal coalition was an emergence of different movements coming together. This may be an intrinsic part of liberalism, which is also a destabilizing part of liberalism. Some elements of the New Left. In politics, the New Left was a huge advocate for free speech, even to the point of protecting free speech of relatively hateful speech. Understanding that I do not agree with what you say, but I shall fight to the death your right to say it. This idea from Voltaire, classical liberal idea, that's going to continue on in this new left tradition. But another area in this is politics. Hey, look, we've almost blown ourselves up in 1962. Maybe we need to take another look at this idea. So the New Left is going to become pretty staunchly anti-war. And they're going to organize around this idea of an anti-war movement, anti-war in general, but especially nuclear disarmament. A cornerstone of the New Left movement during this time period is nuclear disarmament. Look, we can't ever use these nuclear bombs. So why do we have them? Why are we spending money on them? We're spending billions of dollars on nuclear bombs that, if we ever use, will obliterate the planet. We can't use them. It doesn't make sense to keep these things around. So a lot of anti-nuclear activists are going to come out of this New Left tradition. Culture. The New Left is taking a look around at just how stultifying and alienating and sterile is the culture that they are experiencing. We talked about this conformity with the organization man, and the standardized version of family. And the New Left is going to look at this and say, this isn't good. This is basically you just have a bunch of people who are conforming and walking in exactly the same direction. We don't want this. Work. It's not enough. We don't want to just go to work and clock in at 9 a.m. and clock out at 5 p.m. and get our paycheck every Friday and then watch TV. No, we want to do work that is meaningful. And consequently, we believe that everybody wants to do work that is meaningful. So we wanted to take a look at this from a different, that work should be personally fulfilling, not just drudgery that we do because that's our responsibility to do. Sexuality and gender. The New Left is going to, pioneer ideas of sexual equality, sexual liberation, and gender equality. That men and women are equals, and that sexual expression is a good and natural thing. That sexual expression is not a sinful matter of sin, as the traditionalists would have you believe that it is something that should be embraced. And even going a bit more radical, even kind of questioning the very foundations of things like marriage and monogamy and that kind of stuff. So we kind of hear some of this. When you take a look at the Stephen Stills song, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. Well, they're talking about sex in this case. So self-expression, not being constrained by the rules of expression, that we should be able to express ourselves in our own way, which oftentimes manifests itself in people using profanity or people following these weird musical forms that didn't seem to make too much sense. But also we start seeing this a lot of emphasis on personal creativity and art and literature and poetry that was coming out of this particular time. Economics. Economics is a structural thing, and therefore the things that happen within economics are structural. So stuff like poverty. Poverty is not, as the traditionalists would have you believe, a matter of people who are just too lazy and don't want to work. No, poverty, according to the New Left, is structural. It is endemic to our political system, and therefore, if we want to fight poverty, we're going to have to fight, and we're going to have to reshape and reorder our society to make sure that people get their fair share and can live decent lives in a society with vast amounts of wealth. Also, we're taking a look at the environment. This was a time period where, for instance, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio burst into flame. I'm no hydrologist, but I really don't think rivers are supposed to burst into flame. That's something that doesn't seem natural. And what had happened? Well, there were so many pollutants, there was so much chemical in that water, it almost couldn't help but burst into flame, right? And it wasn't even the first time. And many of these folks in the New Left are thinking, well, wait a minute. That's bad. So we also see the publication of the great book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. We start to think, oh, wait a minute, what are the environmental consequences of all the chemicals that we're using, of all of the pollutants that we're putting into our environment? So maybe environmentalism isn't just about protecting lands and conservation. Maybe environmentalism is a little bit more than that. Maybe there are larger forces, and these are economic forces that are at work, that are stripping the value from the land and putting wastes into the environment that are detrimental to us. So this is the new left, and these guys were very, very active, and they were participants in a lot of these social movements. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody in, say, the feminist movement or the environmental movement, that all of these people were members of the new, or advocates of the new left. But the new left, these movements was a good locus for the new left to participate and end in. And these were also young people with means. They were college educated. They were going to go into professions and careers. Many of them were going to go into politics. So these are folks who already kind of had a step up and had embraced some of these liberal ideologies, and they're going to be able to put pressure on the actual political establishment. Now, we've talked a lot about Lyndon Johnson with regards to civil rights, But Lyndon Johnson wasn't only interested in civil rights. He also became very interested in some of the other areas that were affecting civil rights, and maybe we're going to kind of say maybe a little bit of this New Left idea. Now, Lyndon Johnson was not a member of the New Left by any stretch of the imagination, but there was an awful lot of pressure being put on him from below to act on civil rights. And also, let's face it, Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists were also making the connection between the plight of minority groups and African Americans and the civil rights claim and economic claims, the problems of poverty and the problems of housing. And we've already talked about some of these things that were affecting, especially these urban centers. We'll talk about how these urban centers were just kind of combusting at this time with urban riots all over the country. We'll talk about that probably in the next video, the video after that. Again, the publication of The Other America was very revealing as well, very eye-opening. So Lyndon Johnson decides he's going to do something about this. In fact, he wants to do something about this that's actually going to rival Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal. And this was a program that he comes up with that he refers to as the Great Society, or maybe what we could call a New Deal. Look, we've got to do something about poverty. And of course, there's practical contingencies here. Of course, there's a lot of instability going on in society, and no president wants to be around when there's a lot of instability. And poverty was a big part of this instability. Also, too, we had to present ourselves to the world. We were presenting ourselves to the world as a capitalist society that can bring unprecedented wealth and prosperity to your society. We can't have a society in which a fifth or a quarter of our population are still poor. That just doesn't look good. So we're going to have to figure out ways of dealing with this. Now there's a lot of programs. I have this little chart here. Again, kind of like the New Deal. I'm not going to go through all of these things individually. It'll just take too long, and you'll be, But he does get together. He gets a group of folks together. They write up the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which opens up what was called the Office of Economic Opportunity to guarantee and to make sure that economic opportunities are available to every American, regardless of your social strata. And some of the programs that were put into effect: Job Corps, neighborhood youth groups, Head Start, Volunteer Services of America, Community Action. All of these things are attempts to try to get to get at the problem of poverty and get resources and get money into the hands of people who really, really needed it. The Medicare Act of 1965, if those of you who have jobs, if you look at your pay stub, a nice chunk of your money comes out of your paycheck every week or every 2 weeks or whatever it is that you get paid, and that money goes into Medicare. That's a result of this Great Society programs. And that is, and it may be, it's especially for young people, it's kind of annoying. I'm 17 years old, I'm paying into Medicaid, and I don't need this. Well, you will. So you're going to need that money at some point. At some point, if you are lucky, you will live to be in your 60s, 67 or 68 or whatever it is now, that before you get, or 65, I'm sorry, for Medicare it's still 65. That money's going to come in kind of handy. Well, this is the Medicare Act, to provide health insurance and health care to the elderly. I mean, the old people, think about it. If you got to go to the doctor every month, that's a significant big chunk of money out of your paycheck. Money that isn't going to go into the economy as a whole. So the Medicare Act was designed to help that. Immigration and Nationality Act, we're going to look at some of those old quotas that were put into place in the 1920s, 1930s, and we're going to say, wait a minute, no. We're going to just make it, these were, of course, quotas that privileged white immigrants and, kind of rejected non-white immigrants. And we're going to say, no, we're going to equalize this across the board. So we're going to have everybody is going to go through the same system under the Immigration and Nationality Act. Medicaid. In 1965, amendments were added to the Social Security Act to provide Medicaid. Health care for poor people, for people who are not making a lot of money. Of course, a lot of this is going to be driven by state governments and state state distribution. But either way, this is a huge benefit for people who don't have enough money. And if you don't have any money and you got to, it's a good idea to have a medical your heart checked. Well, I'm not going to do it. I'm okay. It's just a little pain. I'm not going to worry about it. But if you have Medicaid, you might actually say, all right, well, I'll actually go to the doctor. Now, did this Great Society work? Of course, this is a huge, huge debate. Even today, especially today, we still have these debates over welfare and food stamps and all of this other kind of stuff. And a lot of this stuff is stuff that came out of the Great Society. And probably one of the biggest benefits of the Great Society is that it did call attention to issues of poverty and did suggest that government has a role to play in alleviating poverty, even when times are relatively good. That's kind of a stretch. I mean, it was understandable to do something about poverty during the Great Depression because pretty much most everybody was struggling. But now it's, we have a minority of people who are struggling, but we're still making the claim that, wait a minute, we still need to do something about this stuff. Now we can take a look, but again, did it work? And one of the ways that we can look at this, it's not the only way, but it is a way of doing it, is taking a look at the poverty rates that were in existence at that time. So I compiled this graph here from the U.S. Census Bureau, and we can take a look at it. Let me see if we can move this over here. And here we see the graph, and if you take a look at this shaded spot is pretty much the height of the Great Society. I stopped it in 1969 because the economy is going to kind of get wonky around 1969, stock market crash. We'll talk about that later on. So I stopped it here. You can claim that that's relatively arbitrary, and you're going to be right. I do have my reasons for stopping it there, but you may not agree with those reasons. Maybe the shadowed portion should be moved a little bit further to the right. But it's important to understand that even statistical data has its limits. But now if you take a look at this and you look at the poverty rates in 1959 to 1964, you see that, it looks like poverty was going down anyway. So, but if you draw that trend line, this dotted line is a trend line, you're going to see that, as a result of the Great, or at least during the time, I can't say it's as a result of the Great Society, but during the time of the Great Society programs, poverty is actually going to fall a little bit more rapidly than it was falling previous to the Great Society. Now, does that mean that it works? And does that mean that it was necessarily worth the expenditure? I mean, let's be honest. It wasn't a huge acceleration of decreasing poverty rates. It was relatively subtle and relatively mild, and could we have done this through other means? And the debate is still open. I can't answer that question. You have to do that research on your own. But there are some critiques. Again, some of the benefits, we still have some of these laws are still around. But some of the critiques are that ultimately the Great Society programs really didn't address the underlying issues of poverty. That in fact, instead the Great Society programs were directed toward alleviating some of the symptoms of poverty, but didn't ultimately alleviate the structural problems that the New Left is identifying as being a cause of poverty. In other words, the maldistribution of wealth. And of course, the Great Society programs are not going to do anything like that. Also, too, we're looking at a period of deficit spending here. A lot of money is being spent by the government at this stage of the game, and is being collected in taxes. Taxes are going to have to increase in order to just get this, just get that. Is it worth it? And there are folks out there who would suggest that no, this really wasn't all that worth it. Especially when we start seeing 1970, we start seeing that poverty rate start to pop back up again. So this clearly wasn't a permanent fix. For 5 years or 6 years of progress, we really didn't accomplish an awful lot. We also see that as a result of this, there's a tremendous struggle. The government would end up sending money to states, and oftentimes there's huge conflict over where this money was being spent. And oftentimes, federal money that was used by the federal government directly seemed to have been a little bit better spent. But when the federal government gave money to the states to be used, the states oftentimes would just kind of shift the money to the things that they thought were important, and did not necessarily get the money to the and use it directly for dealing with the problems that the programs were designed to fix. To a certain extent, another critique of this is that it simply just raised unrealistic expectations. That President Johnson is coming up and saying, we are going to declare war on poverty, which of course means, how do you win a war on poverty? Well, the only way to really win a war on poverty is to eliminate poverty. And they didn't. We clearly didn't eliminate poverty. Poverty is still around, albeit at lower levels than it was in the 1950s and early 1960s. But poverty is still around, and it still continues to plague us. So this is going to may have added to a certain amount of frustration in the early 1970s when people were saying, hey, what happened to that war on poverty? I'm still poor. And again, we'll talk about some of the consequences of that later on. And ultimately, another big problem that we're going to see happening is, well, the amount of spending and the amount of effort put into fighting a war on poverty is really, really difficult to do when you are actually fighting a real war in a foreign country, as the United States was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and that war, of course, being Vietnam, which will be the subject of another of one of our next lectures coming up. So, so there we have it. Was the Great Society worth it? Well, you'll have to ask yourself that question and do your own research. And what was the influence of the New Left? Was this a New Left idea, or was this simply another extension of progressive liberalism? Of course, we see both trends and currents today. So anyway, that's as much as I'm going to deal with today. I think I probably ranted and rambled a little bit considering, but it happens.